Hello. Good evening. Guys, are you able to hear me and see my screen? Can you please confirm? Okay, great. All right. So we have, I hope all of you have been there for the demonstration, and we're looking at session 1 today. We were talking about business objects data services, the evolvement of business objects data services, how it was called as data integrator before, and what made the change as data services. We've looked at basically what happens or what are all the different sources and targets that it can connect to. We've also looked at the architecture of data services. I'm going to repeat the architecture of data services, and then I'm going to go with the session today. All right. All right, so I hope all of you remember this snapshot. This snapshot is from a local repository. Every single user who has to log into data services has to log into the local repository. And that's why I've taken a snapshot from the local repository. This tells how the different connections are defined for data services. So let's try and understand this, and then I'll talk about the continuation of this. All right. Now, the central component of the architecture in business objects data services consists of the repository. All right. The repository is in the center, and it connects to three major services or service. One is the data services service. Right. The second one is the management console, and the third one is the designer. Right. These are the three connections that we have. We've talked about the different kinds of jobs that data services supports. One is called as the batch job. The second one is called as the real-time jobs. Batch jobs are the ones that are scheduled based on a time frame, and then you can execute them in the background. Whereas real-time jobs are the jobs that are not scheduled on time frame but triggered based on changes that you have on the source, or triggered on whenever the data is pushed from the source system. And these are usually the two kinds of jobs that are available. One is called as batch jobs, the other one is called as real-time or transaction jobs, transaction data jobs. The batch jobs are scheduled using the job server that you find here. In the data services service, you have something called as job server. That is responsible for all the batch jobs. The access server is the one that is responsible for all the real-time jobs. All right, anything that has to be triggered at real-time using real-time client is done by the access server. The engines are the ones that are responsible for data quality. Now, we've spoken about data quality for a bit, but let me just reiterate that. When you talk about quality, always there needs to be a standard. All right, without having a standard, you can never mention the term quality. Quality is basically comparing your particular object based on the standard, and then you will have to get the standard of how your data is. So if you have to compare, you need to have these standard files. Let's say you're comparing country names, or you're comparing street names, or you're comparing just the names or postal codes. So the standard files that you are to compare are called as dictionaries or directories. These are compiled by the postal department, and they are converted by SAP, and then these are available as dictionaries and directories. You need to download them. You need to have special licenses for them, and then you can use them within the data services cleansing transforms or quality transforms. These will take the data that you're passing through and then they will compare them with the standard files. And then based on that, you will have whether your data is within quality standards or outside quality standards. All right. So these dictionaries and directories, you have some of them are male names, female name files, you have country code files, you have postal department or postal code files, street names, and then you have SSN IDs, phone numbers, email domains, company names, abbreviations, right? All of these are standard files. So when your data goes over this standard files, it compares with these files and checks whether your data is within standards or not. And this basically is from the data services service. So these are the three engines that you have in the data services service. Right. The second thing is management console. Right. The management console is a web interface that you have that handles a lot of things like what you do in the administration or within the basis, like defining RFC connections. You will also have execution from you also have an execution from the background jobs handled here. Then you also have the user authorization also handled from the management console. You have the validation reports, cleansing reports, statistics reports. You also have lineage analysis, impact analysis. All right. And a lot more that you do from the management console, and all of this is handled using this interface. But I've also told you that the whole of this is basically done by the administration team or the basis team. What you have access to is just the designer. The interface where you will be working as a migration consultant is only this part of it, so which is the designer. All right. So we will try and understand what is inside the designer. Before we get to that, we need to understand the repository. What exactly is a repository? What does it have inside it? How do you create a repository? What are the different kinds of repositories that we have? One more thing is that from version, so right now what we're looking at is 4.2, and prior to that there were 3.0, 3.2, 4.0, 4.1 and 4.2. These are the versions that are there. All right. So from 4.0 onwards, the path of how the authorizations or how you log into the designer has been changed a little bit. There is an extra layer of security. All right. No, my battery is not gonna die soon. Why would you say that? Just give me one. Hello? Guys, I lost you for a second. Just give me one moment. So we were talking about the different versions, right? 3.0, 3.1, 3.2, 4.0, 4.1, and 4.2. Till 3.2, which is an older version, we can do a direct install of data services. But from 4.0 onwards, there is another layer of security that has been added, which is called as the CMC. So when you log into data services, unless you authorize and authenticate onto the central management console, you cannot actually log into data services. All right. So you have to first authenticate to the central management console and then only log into the data services environment. So let's see how this is done. What are the different kinds of repositories that we have in data services, and then how do we go ahead and understand these repositories? All right. So let me close this, open another slide. All right. In this session, we're going to look at the Lewis, any question?
No, I don't. Can you listen to me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, thanks.
Guys, if you have any question, make sure you raise your hand. I can unmute you if you want to ask anything. If not, you can type in the chat window as well. There is not a lot of difference between 4.1 and 4.2. There are a few connections that are added, and also there are a few functionalities that have been added. There is also the workbench that has been added into the data services client tools. We're going to look at that as well. All right. The integration between HANA and data services also is done. So you have some of these added. Ramanathan Sharma, you have a question? Ramanathan Sharma, you've raised your hand. Any question? Okay, cool. Okay, so let's try and understand what exactly is a repository and what are the different kinds of repositories that you have. Okay. The data services repository is a set of tables that holds user-created and predefined system objects, source and target metadata, and transformation rules. So what it means basically is that when you are trying to execute anything on data services, you will definitely need a source and target. All right. So you are trying to bring data from one source and then or multiple sources, and then you're trying to load data into either single target or multiple targets. Now, on a normal laptop, if you're trying to run anything, you first need the operating system. Just like that, you have to have system tables that will actually execute these jobs inside the data services environment. There should be a synchronization between the jobs that you schedule, the data that you need to pull from the source, and to the data that you push to the target. You also have to have synchronization between the transforms that you define. And all of these have to run in tandem. And to run these, you need system tables that will execute all of these one after the other. And so the repository is basically a collection of tables, system tables. And these system tables are defined by using a tool called as the repository manager. What you take is a database, a blank database, and then you run the repository manager over it. When you run the repository manager over it, it creates a lot of system tables. And these system tables, apart from having these own system tables on that same database, you can also create a few custom tables as well. Though this is not a recommended thing, but you can go ahead and create custom tables as well. And this is basically what is inside the repository, or this is called as a repository. The repository also holds information about source and target metadata. When you connect to a particular source, you want to interact to it with at, let's say, the table level or a function module level, or let's say you want to connect to it at an IDOC level. So based on the metadata at which you're connecting, the system is going to hold that information as well. Likewise with the target system too. All right. So apart from just the system tables, it will also hold information about your source and target metadata. And majorly what we do inside data services is transforming data. And so the transformation rules, the definition of these will also be held inside the repository. All right. So we will definitely see how this repository is created and what are the tables that are there. I'll show you those as well. Now each repository is stored on an RDBMS like MySQL, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, Sybase, and IBM DB2 including SAP HANA. So the repository, for creating a repository, you need an RDBMS, and there are only limited RDBMS that it understands. MySQL, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, Sybase, IBM DB2, and SAP HANA. These are the 6 or 7 RDBMS that you can use for creating a repository. One important aspect is that each repository is associated with one or more job servers. Each repository has to be linked to the job server. That is mandatory. All right. So this is what we would be doing on the data services repository. So let's try and see exactly what is a repository, how is it created. Okay. There are basically 3 kinds of repositories. Okay. One is called as the local repository, the second one is called as the central repository, and the third one is called as the profiler repository. So let's see what is called as the local repository, because this is one of the mandatory repositories that you will need within data services. So the local repository basically stores definitions of data services objects, data stores, jobs, data flows, workflows, and all of that. You will have to log in through a designer and associate it with a job server. Every single user who has to log into data services will need a local repository. And the local repository, basically what it does is, it allows you to synchronize the job server, the management console, and also the designer that you're logging in. And all the jobs that you define, the transformations that you define, all of them are handled as definitions onto that repository. So let's try and see how to create a local repository. What are the system tables and how information gets stored in there. You can write down the steps in case you want to create a repository. Though this is a part of the administration or the admin team, you will need to understand what happens in the background. So I'm going to show that as well. So let's log on to the server. So if you have registered or enrolled with us, they would be giving you the address, a remote desktop address to which you can connect. And so once I put that in here and then click on connect, you will have to go ahead and authenticate to that connection. My username is Emmanuel and I have a password. Likewise, they'll be giving you also one. Once I connect to this particular server, I would have if I go into all programs, you will find data services 4.2 in here. Okay, and it consists of all of these different client tools. Let me first explain to you what these client tools are, and then I will talk about how to create a repository. The data services designer that you see in here, that is the interface for data services on which we will be working. All right, that is how you log into data services. The second one is the data services local selector. This is in case you want to change the language from English to, let's say, Chinese or Japanese or French. All right, so in case you want to change the language, then you can go to Data Services Local Selector, specific to your language. The third one is Data Services Management Console. I told you this is the web interface to which you will be connecting to. And this is how you will be looking at how to handle RFC connection, user groups, load balancing, executing data in the background, and all of these are handled from here. Statistics reports, calculation, the cleansing reports, validation reports, all of these are handled from Data Services Management Console. Next, you have the Data Services Repository Manager. If you have to create a repository, all right, it will be it local repository or central repository or profiler repository, all of these are created using the Data Services Repository Manager. When you run your database through the Repository Manager, it will create all the system tables that are necessary for running this tool. All right, so you will find all the system tables available in the Data Services Repository Manager. Data Services Server Manager basically handles all the job server, the access server. You also have the SMTP settings are also defined here, alerts and SMTP settings. So the Data Services Server Manager has all of these compositions. Then you have the Data Services Workbench. The Data Services Workbench is a new entry from 4.1 onwards. And you can see that this is created for somebody like a novice, somebody who hasn't had a lot of experience with data services, to make things easy for them. For example, I'm replicating data as is from my SAP system into HANA box. So if I want to go ahead and use Data Services Workbench, I could. So I am not creating any transformations, directly loading from a particular source to a target. In that scenario, I can use the Data Services Workbench. Then there is the SAP License Manager, which allows you to update licenses in case you buy data services licenses, or if you're buying the data quality license, you can upgrade this, add this SAP License Manager. And then last, you have the Data Services Documentation. It has the documentation of all the different connections that you want to do, your technical manuals, your guides to connecting to, let's say, SAP system, or let's say Salesforce, or Oracle systems, or Siebel. Any system that you connect to, you will have all of these available here. Okay. So now that we've seen the components that we have in data services, let's try and understand what exactly is a repository and what we would need for a repository. The repository is, I told you, like a set of system tables, right? First, how do you get to that system tables? What we need is an RDBMS. And on my server, we have the Microsoft SQL Server 2008. So let's go and create a database. So I go in here and then SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to click on Connect. Once I connect, you can see here there are database, security, server objects, replication, and all that. So I can right click on the database and then say create a new database. And I'm going to call this as, let's say, DS underscore. This is June, right? So let me put it as DS underscore June. So I'm going to click on OK, and this will create a blank database. So if I go into my system, I can find this one here, DS underscore June. So you can see here, this is completely a blank database. There's no tables in here, nothing. I just created a normal database. Once I create the database, I need to also define the security for this database. So I go into the security, go to logins and then create new logins. The login name that I'm going to use here is ds_June. I can select SQL authentication. I'm not going to use Windows authentication, and I'm going to give a username and password. I'm going to put in the same username and password, ds_June. Enforce password policy, I've unchecked that, and let me point this to ds_June. The server roles that you have here, I'm going to define this to be system admin, and then the user mapping I'm going to link to ds_June. I'm going to click OK. So what I have defined basically is my login credentials into the database. Okay. Now let's see what I'm going to do. You've seen that the database is empty, right? So you can see there's no data in it. All right. This is a blank, fresh database. All right. So ds_June, there's nothing inside this. Now what I'm going to do here is I take the start. I go to the start menu. Go to all programs. Under data services 4.2, I have this tool called as the data services repository manager. I'm going to click on it, and it's going to bring up the repository. Here you have local, central, and profiler repository. So it allows you to create either a local repository or a central repository or a profiler repository. So I'm going to keep that local, and then the database type that we have logged into is Microsoft SQL Server, so I'm going to put that in there. What is the database server name? So if you go in here and if you go all the way up, you will usually find the server name here, BO41. That is the name of the server. So I'm going to put that in here, BO41. The database name that we have created is ds_June. The username and password also is the same. So basically you are connecting to the database, and then you're trying to run something using the repository manager and install stuff on the repository manager. So what I'm going to do right now is click on create, and once I have actually entered the password, all of these got enabled: create, upgrade, get version, and close. So create is the option for creating the repository tables and all of that. And the upgrade is in case you're on an old version and you want to upgrade your repository, you can go ahead and click on the upgrade also. The get version basically tells you what version of the repository you're on, and then you can click on close. So right now what I'm going to do is click on create, and you can see that the system starts creating all of these system tables onto my database. All right. So it tries to create all these needed functions and transforms and metadata for all of these are created on my database. Okay. It doesn't take too long. Now you can see the local repository was successfully created. Okay. Once this is done, you can click on close. I'm going to close my database as well. And I'm going to open this. And now let's go to the database that we have just created, which is ds_June. Now we've seen that there was no table or anything inside this. Right now if I open, you can see a whole bunch of system tables that are created. These have been created because of running it through the repository manager. The repository manager creates all of these system tables which allow you to run this particular tool or data services designer. It helps you to integrate and synchronize the job server, the management console, and the data services designer. Okay. Once this is done, this is not it. For you to actually get into data services, you still have to do some more things. But basically, these are the tables, the system tables that are created when you create a repository. These are all available here. Okay. Once you create the system tables, the next thing that you will have to create or you will have to enable is you have to register your repository on the job server. So if you click on the Data Services 4.2, you have Data Services Server Manager. The first thing that we did was create a database, and then we defined the security for the database. The second thing that we did was we ran the database through the repository manager. And then what we would be doing right now is register the repository on the Data Services Server Manager. So I'm going to click on this. Click on Configuration Editor, so you can see here Job Server, Access Server, SMTP settings, and alright. So I'm clicking on Job Server, go to Configuration Editor. Here you have one job server called as job server underscore me. I can go ahead and create that, then click on the edit button if I want to add my repository to the existing job server. If I want to create a new job server altogether, I can click on add. Alright, so I'm going to click on edit for now. And there are already a few repositories that are added in here. I'm going to add a new repository here. The repository that I was using is connecting to BO41 database server. The database name is ds_June. The username also is database ds_June, and then the password. So once I go ahead and define that, I can click on apply. This will add my repository. You can see here BO41 ds_June. That is added that repository onto the job server. And now if I have to make these connections work, I will have to reset my job server. So if I click on close and restart my job server, you will find that the system will come up with this message. This will restart data services service on this machine. So I'm going to click on OK. As long as that hourglass is there, it means the service is restarting. Once it goes off, it means it is restarted. So the second thing that we did was register the repository onto the job server. Now I told you that from 4.0 onwards, you have to go ahead and authenticate onto the central management console. And for doing that, firstly, you will have to also, apart from registering your repository onto the job server, you will also have to register your repository onto the central management console. So let's click on the start menu, go into all programs. This time you're going into SAP Business Intelligence. And here you have Business Objects BI Platform 4. And when you click on it, you can find that here there is one which says Business Objects BI Platform Central Management Console. So I need to click on it, and this will bring me to this interface. So I have to authenticate my CMC login credentials. Once I log in here, you can find that at the bottom there is something called as data services. This interface basically was used for business objects reporting tools, but now even data services is added onto it so that the control can be at one common place. So I'm going to click on data services, and here it will show all the repositories that are registered onto this particular central management console. Okay. And to the same existing list, I'm going to add our existing repository as well. So I'm going to click on configure new data services repository. I'm going to put my repository name, my password, first my description, BODS, let's say training for June. The database type that we have connected to is not my Oracle. We have connected to Microsoft SQL Server. The database server name that we have connected to is BO41. This is the port number for the database. The database name is ds_June. We are not trying to do any Windows authentication. The username for that particular database is ds_June, and same with the password as well. So once you key in all this information, the next thing that you need to do is test connection. Test connection allows you to check whether you are connected to this particular system or no. So let me click on this. Test connection. It's trying to do something here this time. Alright, so here it is BO41. So you can see successfully connected to the repository. I click OK. And you can click on save. And this will actually add the existing repository onto the central management console. You can see here ds_June is added as a local repository. BODS training for June. Okay. Once you do that, you can go ahead and close this central management console. That's when you can actually log into the, click on start, click on all programs, go into data services, and then you log into the data services designer. Username, take HANA1, password is what I key in here. And then look for the repository that we have created. It is ds_June. So select that and then click on OK. Put in the same password and then click OK. The password for our repository is ds_June. You can cancel out any repository for this is profiler repository, so you can say cancel. Likewise, if you get central also, you can say cancel. But this will log me into a new interface of the data services environment. There is nothing defined in here, no logical connections, no jobs, nothing. So everything is empty and new in here. There is a new designer interface which you have connected to. And these are basically the steps that the admin guys will do. So they'll define the entire job server and all that, and then give you the access into it. Okay. Now, before we go in and try to understand or try to create a job or try to move data across, first thing, we need to have a little knowledge about what is happening inside the data services system. Okay, and what are the different objects that are there inside the data services environment. And to understand that, let's try and look at Firstly, what happens inside the local repository? What are the different kinds of repositories that we have? And then we will see the hierarchy of how the objects are created. What are the components inside the data services environment? Firstly, what we have just logged into as an individual user is called as the local repository. Every single user will be given a login credentials to log into the designer. And to log into it, we need to have our own repository. And this is basically called as the local repository. So if you are working for a particular company, what they will first tell you is, okay, this is basically the object that you need to migrate, or this is what you need to bring data from. And so you can work on this specific repository. These are the connections of the source and target systems. And then based on our requirements, define transformations and bring the data to the target system. Now, because of the work breakdown that is given, so let's say each one is given 2 objects or 3 objects to handle, and there are, let's say, 5 people in the team. So there are totally 15 objects that you need to migrate. Somebody is handling customer and material, somebody is handling vendor, somebody else is handling, let's say, company code. Yes, Ramanathan Sharma, the repository is created by system admin. I've unmuted you. You have a question? This is actually not a part of the developer. This is a part of the admin, but I've showed you so that you understand from where you're coming. All right. Now here, I was talking about individual local repositories, right? At some point of time, when you're trying to do your cutovers, basically moving from one landscape to the other, from development to quality or quality to production, you would want to go ahead and bring all your jobs together onto one job server, because in quality and production, you don't have the authorization to make changes. You will have to schedule your jobs and then move them into quality and production. And you want to bring all of them under one repository, or sometimes you want to keep a backup of your existing repository. In that scenario, you use something called as the central repository. The central repository, so each local repository is a single user environment, I told you. And the central repository is a multi-user environment. When you want multiple people to log into the data services environment, basically, you will be using the central repository. The central repository, at the heart of it, is basically a physical storage for taking a backup of all the objects that you create in your data services environment, like your logical connections, the jobs that you define, the workflows, the data flows, your transformations, all of them can be backed up, and they'll be backed up into the central repository. From the central repository, you can transport them to quality or production, and that's the best way of how you can transport your objects. You also have version control, and you don't execute any jobs from the central repository. So it kind of works this way. Let me show this snapshot. So you have a central repository, and to the central repository you have multiple local repositories that you connect. So let's say there is another local repository that is available, and you're connecting this local repository also to the central. You might have another one, and that is also connected to the central repository. So when you connect these individual local repository to the central repository, what happens is all the objects that you have created in here, you can go ahead and push them into the central repository, which means that, let's say I create material, or somebody creates customer, or somebody creates vendor. All of these can be loaded into the central repository. So it will hold the material, the customer, and the vendor information or vendor jobs, all of them in the central repository. This allows, let's say the one who has created material wants to use something about the customer. So you can actually bring this customer into the local repository in here. This part of bringing out an object from the central repository into the local repository is called as a checkout. Okay, If you apply a checkout, it basically lets you bring another object that somebody has created into your local repository. And for you to actually go ahead and you can execute the job, you can go modify the object. Once you complete it, you will have to check it back into the central repository. And that part is called as check-in. Unless you don't check it back in, the object is locked for you and the central repository. So that multiple people don't access that same job and modify it, and the system is not able to track it. What the system does is it locks the object between the local repository and the central. So if somebody is trying to modify anything on the same object, it doesn't let you. And if somebody tries to make the change, let's say the same guy, M is trying to change the object of job server and then put that in the central repository, it will also maintain versions. So it'll, once you log back in, it'll maintain a version. And then you can access the version that you want as well. Okay. If you don't want to lock the object, you just want to bring that structure directly into your object, you can use the get command. Okay. The central repositories are of two types. One is called as the secure central repository. The second one is called as the unsecure central repository. So every single has to be defined as a secure or unsecure central repository. Secure central repository means it needs an additional username or credentials of passwords and usernames, whereas the unsecure central repository, you don't need the username and password, you just need to activate the connection. So that's basically the advantage of the unsecure central. Mostly in the jobs, in the production environment, or in the real-time environment, you use unsecure central repository. So central repository is more like a storage space. All right, you cannot run any jobs from the central repositories, but you can hold all of this information in case, let's say, this gets for some reason this entire local repository crashes. In that scenario, you can create another local repository and export all your objects from the central to the newly created local repository. Or let's say you want to go ahead and bring all of this information and keep a backup. That's when you use the central repository. One more important thing is the local repository and the central repository have to be on the same database and database type. What I mean by that is you cannot have the local repository on Microsoft SQL Server and have the central repository on Oracle. That doesn't happen. If you create this on the SQL, you will have to create the central repository also on SQL. If you also have to be very careful with the version. If this is the older version, you will have to put, let's say I'm using Microsoft SQL Server 2008, I have to create the central repository also on Microsoft SQL Server 2008. I cannot create it on SQL Server 2010. Using get, since we cannot lock, we cannot change, right? It is only display mode. No, you can change in your own local repository, but you will not be writing it back into the central, so you don't make any changes onto the central. The get command allows you to only bring it to your local repository. It doesn't let you place it back in the central. So even if you change, that change is specific for your local repository. You cannot go and reload that back into the central. So that's why you use the get command. All right. So this is how the central repository works. Okay. And then you have the third kind of repository called as the profiler repository. When you're moving data from one system to the other, the second system also should understand the kind of data that you're dealing with. Only then you can have tables specifically created to accept that data. Only then you can go ahead and understand whether it is redundant data or it is unique data, or if it has any defects in the data, or if it has only null values or blank values, what is the maximum value, minimum value, what is the data type, and all this information is basically understood only when you do profile. For example, a simple example is, let's say, your resume. You have a resume, and then the resume basically consists of all the expertise and experience that you have. You will, when there is a job opening, you will first send your resume. You don't go directly there. Once they check your resume, if they find it to be fit for the requirement, how will they know? Because there is a gist of all that you know in your resume and what you're interested in. So if they think that is the fit, then they will call you in, where the actual talks will happen. So the profiler is also like that. So it will basically scan through the data that you have from the source, and then it will give out the profiler indication about whether that's if that's the kind of data types that you need to create on the target, or the length of it, what is the maximum value, minimum value, do they support null or no. All that information is handled using the profiler repository. Okay. The last one that you see is the cleansing package. That is not a repository. That's just a package that you install on each repository. Okay. Now that you've seen what are the three major different kinds of repositories, I'll show you how to create the central and profiler repository a little later on as we look in classes. How do you handle migrations? For now, what we will be trying and understanding is what is the hierarchy of objects that you create in data services. The hierarchy of objects basically consists of the projects on the top of the list. The highest in the organization capability is basically the project. Now, if you guys are from a BW background, you would understand something called as an info area. An info area is like a namespace that is created where all your objects can be held together. Okay, so it's like when you go to a computer, you go to my computer, you find my documents, my videos, and all of this. Why do they have that? My pictures and all of that. Basically to arrange your data. All right. So similarly, projects are used to arrange your jobs, and the moment you get into a project, you can identify where your jobs are. So this is what is the highest level. It looks pretty much the same symbol as a folder. All right. And these are called as projects. Yeah, it could be an environment from BPC, or it could be something from BW. If you are comfortable with HANA, it is similar to package within HANA. All right, so individually you have your own folder. Okay, just give me one moment. Yeah, so here, if I log into the data services environment, so you have something called as a project area in here. Okay, you can see this is called the project area, and at the bottom also you have project. So when you have to create a new project, all that you need to do is click on create a new project. So for example, here I'm going to click on create a new project. Let's say I give the name as session 1. Okay, I'm going to click on create, and that creates that folder in the project area. Likewise, right below here you have the local object library, which has a lot of submenus. You find the folder created here as well. Session 1 is created in the project area. It is also created in the local object library. What can you create under this? If you right click on the project, you can either create a batch job or a real-time job. Okay. So that's basically the idea of the project. So you can create any number of jobs. So I create job, and then I can right click and say create a new job. So I can define my name job underscore session 1. All right. and then I can create job underscore session 2 or alright, so I can create any number of jobs based on the kind of logic that I'm trying to build. So I can click on remove. I can go to the job level and also go and remove this from here. Delete. Okay. So once I go ahead and create the project in the project area, at any point of time, you have only one project. So let's say here I have created session 1. I want to create another project called as session 2. So you can see immediately the session 1 is kicked out, only session 2 comes in here. So if I want to bring in session 1, I double click on it. So it will overwrite session 2 and bring in session 1. Alright, so at any point of time, you can only log into one project. Okay, that's what you have here. Alright, so here when you created it as a batch job, later on you can right click and say execute, that's a schedule. Whereas when you create it as a new real-time job, it is between two process, real-time process begins and step ends. In between, you go ahead and define your data flows and all of that. So it allows you to go ahead and trigger your information from a source. And then the access server is the one that executes this real-time jobs. The one that executes the batch jobs is the batch job or job server. All right. Then I told you right under the projects you can create the jobs. At any point of time you have only one project that you can write into. Let's see if there's anything else from the project. So what does the project do basically is group of jobs. It holds group of jobs. It is also stored in the local object library. Everything that you create in the main project area will be stored also in your local object library. It's the highest level of organization. Only one project can be open at a particular time. Next to the project is the job. So what is a job? A job is a schedulable object. It allows you to link multiple steps together and then execute them one after the other, either in series or you want to execute something in parallel. You can go ahead and handle that on the job server. It is created using the object library or the project area. There are two types. One is batch jobs and real-time jobs. You can trigger the jobs in the foreground from here. Let's say I can right click on my job and execute it from here, or I can go into the management console. Go to administrator. The one that we logged into the repository name is ds_June, right? And then we created one job called as job_session1. So once you actually log into the management console, you will find the list of repositories in there. So if you can see here, there's one called as ds_June. So when I click on this, you can see if you go into job configuration, there is a job that you've created called as new_job1. Project is session1. You can click on add to a schedule, or you can execute directly from here. Or you can try and export this to a third party as well. Can you give an example of project in real life? So it could be anything. So if I want to go ahead and start off doing my extractions, so let me just show you one of my systems in here. I'm going to log into my production system, which I'm working for a particular client. So when I log into this particular system, let's say I'm handling something for a vendor. Okay. So my vendor basically deals with, first step is to bring in some data using some extractions from different sources. So I will go ahead and bring these. So let's say here, go into my data services designer. So if I go into so you can see here some of the project names that I've created, vendor underscore extracts. So basically I would go ahead and bring in my lookup tables, or I'm trying to extract some information from jobs. So I go ahead and give that name in there. Or let's say I want to go ahead and build jobs for transformation. So I define some conversion jobs saying that I'm transforming these jobs. Okay. Or if I click on it, you would have the whole job defined in here, step by step how it should execute. Or let's say I just want to go ahead and do some reconciliation. For that, I have created some more jobs. Okay. And the project basically holds all of these jobs. You can see all of these jobs listed down in here without any job connection. You can go ahead and drag an object into this, directly link it there as well. So if I want to use this job, I can just drag it from here. It gets added. If you want to remove it, you can just remove it. Doesn't delete it from here, it just adds it back into the same job list. All right. So once you understand what a job is, the job basically links all the different processes that you have one to the other. And that's what a job does. Okay, and you can schedule these jobs either in the foreground, or you can do it from the background from the management console. Okay. Next is the workflow. The project is basically what you will go ahead and create as the first level of organizing. The second level of organizing inside the job, you want to go ahead and define your entire logic under one folder. Then you create something called as a workflow. Basically allows you to organize your jobs in a good way so that you can look at it and see that it is not too complicated and it is simple. And that's basically why you have the workflow, to group all your objects together. It is not mandatory. You can go ahead and go do it without even the workflow as well. But if there is something complex and you're not able to follow that all that well, so you can create it inside the workflow. Okay. Here the workflow allows you to organize it well. So if you create a workflow, so these objects that you very commonly use, you find it right on the extreme right on the tool palette. You find this blue arrowhead that is called as the workflow. The yellow one is called as the data flow. So if I want to create anything, so let's say right now I'm in the job level. So if I want to create a workflow, I can directly click on the workflow and then say workflow underscore session 1. Every object that I create here in the project area, immediately that object will be created in my local object library as well. So I find that in here. Okay. So once I go ahead and create the workflow, I can even create something in parallel if I want to. I can link them to make them run in series. If there is no dependency, I can just run them exclusively. They'll run in parallel as well. Okay. And then you have within the workflow, if I go into the workflow, I will find where I can go ahead and create my data flow as well. All right, so you can go ahead and create your workflows. One more thing, if you right click on a workflow, you have something called as properties. You can click on properties. It has two options, execute only once and recover as a unit. Execute only once basically allows you to execute the workflow. Let's say you have a big job and your workflow is there multiple times. You can execute that to run only once. Okay, so that's basically execute only once. Recover as a unit is a scenario where in case you execute the job and then halfway through execution if it failed and you want to start off exactly from where it failed. In that scenario, you can click on recover as a unit. So when you select recover as a unit, all the logic that you define under it will be recovered as well. So if I click on apply here, the workflow will have this green thing and you can execute it by click on execute. So yes, and then here there's an option for enable recovery. So if you select that and execute it, automatically will be recovered. All right, so this option also is available. Okay. Then inside the workflow is actually the data flow where the actual logic of connecting your sources and targets and defining the logic is defined. So you can call this as data flow underscore session 1. And here is where you define the entire logic. Okay. If I want to go ahead and bring in my data from a table to a target, if I want to bring it from, let's say, an Excel sheet, or you want to bring it to HANA, or you want to load it to SAP using iDocs, anything, all of it is defined here. But for defining a logical connection, you have to go into the local object library, and here you have something called as data store, and here you will define your connection. So let's say you click on new. It allows you to connect to databases, to any of these databases. It could be SQL Server, it could be HANA, or it could be Sybase, or any database it will be letting you connect. Or you can connect to an SAP application, or you can connect to an SAP BW system, source and target, or you can connect to a web service, or you can connect to a database or adapter. All of these are different data store types, logical connections that you can connect to. All right. So we will see how to go and define these logical connections from the next session. And then we will talk about how do we go ahead and move your data from one system to the other. How do we define a job, and how do we load data from one source system to the other. Okay. Any questions so far, guys? Anything that you would want to advise? Am I running too fast, or is something not understandable? You can give your feedback. Any questions? Nagaraj Rao, Rajiv, Ramanathan, Selvakumar, Srinivas, Surendra, Uday. Lewis, any questions, any of you? Yeah, I'm going to go a little slow, don't worry. I'll make sure everybody understands everything, all right? So we will start, so we've already started looking at practical stuff. So Rajiv Subramaniam.
Yeah, hi. Just sorry to repeat it. Another example of a real-time workflow that has been defined. If can, I know that sooner or later you will take us into it, but okay, just to give an example, if you could.
So it's basically, let's say here, I want to go ahead and do my extractions of jobs. Okay, so I go into my vendor extracts, and then I can find that I've defined two major workflows. Let's say I click on one, I have lookup tables, and then I have some enrichment files. So if I open my lookup tables, I have all my data flows listed in here. Individually, I'm picking up data from flat files into my target tables. But what I'm holding, because this is all multiple, basically all individual stuff, I have not linked one to the other, so they run in parallel. But I'm holding all of this together in a simple form using the workflow. So if I'm seeing from the outside, it is pretty simple, just two workflows. But if I go in, I have a whole bunch of extractions that I have held inside. Even for this, I have these data flows dependent, so I have linked one to the other. So after this data flow executes, this one will execute. All right, so I have some logic that I've defined here, some where conditions and all that. So I can write annotations as well, basically for somebody else to understand what I have done. Okay.
So what were you doing when you were doing this? If I could ask, that is, what were you doing? You were taking vendor tables, and what was the real life scenario that you were trying to create?
I'm trying to send this from an Oracle or an Excel sheet into my target SAP system. And so I'm picking this data up using the extracts to load data into a staging table. From the staging table,
Okay.
I will go ahead and move it to a landing table where I will handle some transformations. And from the landing tables, I will send it to target tables where I have enriched and transformed data. From the enrichment tables, I will load that through the iDocs into SAP. Get my point?
Okay. Yeah.
All right. So don't worry. I'm going to show all of these as we go along. Any other questions, any of you? All right. So we'll look at the continuation for this, how to create logical connections, how to go ahead and bring data from one source to the target. How do you execute jobs? How do you schedule jobs? We'll go and look at them. All right. So from here, we will be looking only at practical sessions. So I would want all of you to enroll, and I hope all of you have the contact information for Kalyan. This is organized through Techie Training, so you can call Kalyan on this number. So this is 201-478-8484. That's the US number. And if you are in India, you can call him on 880-1000-880. All right, for any kind of access or server access fee or timelines, you can call Kalyan. All right, so he'll be helping you with registration process for enrolling, and then once you do that, then we can go ahead and look at how we can practically move data from one landscape to the other. Okay, that's what we're going to do in the next session. So I hope to see all of you for that session. Okay, any questions, guys? Anything before we close this for this weekend? So don't forget, you will be sent this recorded session. So once you finish this particular session, make sure after a little bit you check your email. Okay, this is important. You will have information about the recorded session that happened today. It'll have details of enrollment. Right. It'll also have our contact details, and also you will have alerts of the schedule. Okay, and yeah, so I hope to see all of you over the next weekend. We will be going into the core of data services from the next weekend. All right. Thanks for your time, guys, and hope you enjoyed the session. I will see all of you over the next weekend. All right. Once again, have a nice weekend. Have a nice week ahead. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Bye for now.